Hey patrons, welcome back to a new tutorial series, and in this one we're going to be working on painting some really nice festive watercolour Christmas cards. And in this first painting tutorial I'm going to be painting a polar bear on some snow, and as always the reference image and sketch outline are attached for you guys so that you can get your sketch ready and make it really nice and accurate before you start, and also the reference so you can follow along. And also in the description is a list of materials I am using for this painting. So I'm starting off by using my tape to remove some of the excess graphite on my sketch outline so it's a bit lighter so that it won't show through my watercolours in any areas. And I'm going to start off by working on the sky. So we're going to be doing just one colour for this painting. I wanted to start off quite easy, so we're just going to be using Payne's Grey for the whole of this painting. So like I said, we're starting off with the sky, and I want to use the wet in wet technique. So I want to pre-wet the whole of the sky first. And as you can see, I'm being careful to work my way around the edge of the polar bear and also the snow, because you don't want to get everywhere where otherwise the colours for the sky will bleed onto the polar bear and it just will make it a bit more messy. I am using the silver black velvet paintbrushes for this. And I'm just using a few different sizes. You want to make sure that the paper is wet enough, but you don't want puddles of water to form. So just make sure it's got a nice glistening layer. I do find that sometimes with the paper it absorbs the initial water that's applied to it, so I do go over with a bit more water afterwards just to make sure it really is wet. Because I know a few of you found that the paper dries very quick, and another tip I have is I use cold press paper, and that means that the water doesn't dry as fast on cold press paper as it does with hot press, so I find that I have more time to work on the background. So now that I've wet the whole of the sky, I'm starting to mix up some of my Payne's Grey. I'm using that same brush to mix it up. Just pulling in even more colour from the palette. And I'm going to switch over to a smaller brush to apply this. And I just want to go in horizontal sort of motions to create the look of clouds, and I'm really just tapping in this watercolour. So really have fun with this. I'm being quite random where I'm tapping it in, and I just want to create the nice soft look of clouds. I'm mixing in a bit more water and then a bit more of the paint. And I'm going over to the other side and repeating this process. And I'm not going to apply paint everywhere on the background. I want some of the white paper to show through. Working around the polar bear. And you can see I'm just tapping it in and I'm letting it bleed out. I'm not doing very much myself to blend it out because the paper is wet. That is what it's for, to blend everything out so you don't have any harsh lines. So you can see that I'm leaving some of the white paper in between the blue, and this will help get a better contrast. Just pulling some of the paint down around the polar bear. I'm going to darken up a few areas now as well, because I do want to have a variety of tones in my sky. I want some of the clouds to be darker, some to be lighter. So now I'm just mixing in a bit more of that paint into the mixture I already had. Just added a bit more paint so it's more concentrated, and I'm tapping that into a couple of the clouds. Only a few though, just to add a bit of variety. If you notice that your paper is drying out and the colours aren't bleeding out as much, I recommend waiting for it to dry and then re-wet that area and add more colours. So now you can see that we have a nice variety of values to the background. I added in even more paint to give even darker values. Now I want the sky to have a nice snowy look, so what I will be using for this is salt to add a really, really cool effect. You can use any salt that you have. I just use generic table salt. And you'll want to apply this whilst it's still wet. So I'm going in with my table salt and I'm just sprinkling it on all onto the sky, all over. You want to do it when your paper's wet, because if you let it dry out too much, then the effect won't really work. The paper has to be wet for this to work. You don't want it to be too wet. You don't want puddles of water to be there. So if it's really, really wet, wait for it to dry a bit before you add the salt. And it may not look like it's working straight away, but the more time you leave it, it really does form. So whilst I'm waiting for that to dry, we can start to work on the snow. So again, I'm going to go into that same colour on my brush, and I want it to be more diluted. And I'm just going to go in and start to paint in the shadows for the snow. So you can see on the reference that you can see a few shadows within the snow, and this helps give the look of where the snow is layered and rippled and how it's bumpy, because the snow isn't smooth, it looks very bumpy. So I will be leaving a lot of white gaps in the paper to help give the snow a very bright look, but I did want to go in and paint in some shadows. So when I did my sketch outline, I did draw in the main sort of shadows for the snow, so I knew where they were and what sort of angle they were going at. So I drew in certain curved lines to indicate the shadows for the snow, and I'm just going over them with some of the paint. And I'm doing this quite messily, very loose, very expressive, just to give the idea of the shadows in the snow and to give it more texture to it. Some areas I'm painting lighter, as you can see, with more water, and then some areas I will tap in a bit more of the colour like I'm doing now. Once again, I'm always trying to go for variety. So some lighter areas and then tapping in some darker paint into more of the darker shadows where the dips and bumps in the snow is more extreme. Also, there's a lot of shadow just by the polar bear's feet as well, so we will be adding a lot more shadow there. Adding some shadow to the bottom of the snow. You can see I'm still very much going horizontally, sometimes going downwards at an angle. And I'm being quite quick, I'm not overthinking it, I'm not trying to blend it out too much. And I do leave a lot of the white paper showing through. And I'm going to be leaving a lot of the white paper showing through for the polar bear as well. It can be so tempting to paint in everywhere and cover everything up, but I find that leaving areas white gives the sort of freshest, most bright look. It looks a lot more interesting because you get to see the watercolour effects more, the crisp edges of the shadows of the snow. So I'm working a bit more shadow around the polar bear, for the snow around the polar bear, because the polar bear will cast a bit of a shadow onto the snow. And I'm going to go ahead and tap in a few more shadows throughout some of the shadows we've already created for the snow. So I'm just going to target a few randomly and just add a bit more shadow to them. Just using more concentrated versions of the Payne's Grey with less water. And because the areas are already wet, it nicely bleeds out as well when we tap in some darker shadows. So we've already got all of the shadows for the snow kind of in, we've blocked them all in. Now it's just about adding some contrast by darkening up a few of them. As you can see, I'm darkening up quite a lot of them by the feet of the polar bear. And I'm just looking throughout the reference to see where the darkest shadows are. where the deepest bumps and ripples are in the snow. Now going in and I'm adding shadows for the bits of snow you can see between the legs of the polar bear. So I just want to fill in those little areas as well. And they're quite shadowed, so I'm adding in quite a concentrated amount of that Payne's grey. I'm just tapping over it lightly with a tissue because I don't want it to be that dark. And I'm adding some more shadow directly under the feet and just around by the face of the polar bear. Mixing in some more Payne's grey and just darkening it up even more. And adding a tiny bit of shadow just for the sky directly by the edge of that snow. Once again, just to add more contrast between the snow and the sky. You can see how well that salt has worked with the sky. Once it's dried, it looks beautiful and it creates such a beautiful snowy sky. It looks like a flurry of snow coming down. I love it, and it was so easy to do as well. Just darkening up the bottom of the snow. Oh, and once that salt has dried, once that layer is dried and you let everything dry, make sure that you wipe off the salt. You don't want to leave it on there. So do make sure that you remove the salt once it's dry. And it should come off fairly easily. If you like the salt technique, then you could try it out with different types of salt, see which kind of effects you can get and how they differ. Because you can get salt that is, bigger, chunkier. So that would be fun to try out and experiment with. I'm just repeating, going in and darkening up some of the snow for now. Really adding some darker shadows with really concentrated paint. Just tapping it into a few of those areas. By the way, on my palette it looks like I got purple because I mixed them up and then decided that I just want to keep it a monochrome painting, so I didn't really use it. So I'm adding some more water into my paint. And I'm just going to spend the next few minutes finishing off adding more shadows to the snow, and then I'll come back to talk you through the next part. I'm also going to go in with the Payne's Grey and add a couple of splatters to the background. So I'm going to load my brush up with quite a bit of the Payne's Grey and just splatting it on there just to create more effects, more of an interesting look to the painting. But now we're going to move on to working on the polar bear. And we're going to start off by working on the eyes and the nose of the polar bear, so the darkest areas. So I'm going to be switching over to a really small paintbrush, still a round paintbrush, and I'm mixing in a lot of the Payne's Grey because the eyes and the nose are the darkest areas of the polar bear, so we want the paint to be really concentrated. And I'm just going to work this over the eye and for the nose. And we want the polar bear to look nice and loose and expressive, so we're not going to worry too much about lots of little details. We're just going to get in the basic shadows and create a little bit of fur texture in a few areas, but we want to keep it nice and expressive and loose. Just painting in the nose and also a little bit of the mouth as it curves around. Just really concentrating on looking back and forth between the reference photo and my painting to make sure that I'm on the right track. I'm adding a bit more shadow around the side of the face to add more contrast between the polar bear and the sky. Just using the tissue to lighten it up a little bit. Repeating that process just by the ear of the polar bear. And I'm just going around the shape of the ear. As you can see, at the moment we've got a bit of the sky colour on the ear, so we're going to be going in with gouache and painting over that so it's more highlighted. So even if you paint over something by accident, you can still go and fix it if it's really light with gouache. So now I'm going to work on getting in some of the structure and shadows of the face so that it has more structure. So you still need to paint in the core shadows. So I'm first painting in the shadow for the nose and underneath the eye, using paint that's a lot more diluted, so adding more water to that Payne's Grey. Just painting in where the basic shadow is, and also just getting in that other eye. I'm also painting in the ear, because that's quite dark in the reference. And there's a lot of shadow underneath the face, so the neck of the polar bear, so we're going to be adding some paint there. And we're only really adding paint to the shadowed areas. Everything else is staying white, so you're just painting in the shadows. And you're doing this very loosely. So as you can see, I'm painting in underneath the face, well, just by the sort of underneath bit where it's going into the neck, and also by the nose and mouth, that's more shadowed. I recommend blocking in the shadows with a very diluted wash of the Payne's Grey, and if you need to darken it up, you can just tap in some darker values onto that wet surface, that wet sort of wash you've already got in. So I'm adding some more shadow to the legs of the polar bear as well, to the areas that aren't getting as much light hitting them. Also by the neck of the polar bear. And what I recommend, the reference is already pretty much in a monochrome sort of colour, but you can convert it to black and white or just put a dark blue overlay on it so that you can see the dark and light values better and where the shadows need to be. So I'm just painting very lightly the shadows on the legs of the polar bear. That's where I found most of the shadow needed to be, because like I said, those areas aren't getting as much light to them. Also adding a bit of shadow to the top of the head and just below the ear. You can see sometimes I'm using strokes of my brush that is going with the direction the fur is going in to give the sort of look of a furry animal without having to add too much detail. So I just took a few minutes away from the painting, that's why that area has dried out. But now I'm going in and working on the body of the polar bear, just with a very light wash of colour, blocking in those core shadows. And like I said, it's still so important to get in the shadows for the body to give the correct anatomy and structure to the body, to give it some sort of depth and dimension. You can see that I'm curving my shadows around the body. I recommend using the wet on dry method here rather than wetting the whole of the polar bear, because you do want the white of the paper to be preserved, and I like having the harsh edges for the shadows in this area. So now I want to start to deepen all of this up now that we've gone in and we've sort of blocked in a first wash for where all of the shadows are. We've blocked in where all of the main shadows are, so it's time to darken them up. So I mixed up some darker paint and I'm focusing on getting a few little fur details in. You can see that I'm using a few like brush strokes, going in lines and kind of curving them to give the look of fur. I'm not going crazy with the details, but I like to add in a few little lines to give the idea that there's fur there, to give it more texture. And I'm just focusing on the darkest areas of the polar bear. So the areas that aren't getting as much light, the darkest areas in the reference image. So looking at the reference and darkening up the shadows on the face. Whenever I'm pausing, it's because I'm studying the reference, and it's important to keep checking back in with your reference. You should be looking at it every couple of seconds to make sure you're on the right track. Don't wait too long before looking back at your reference image. So I'm just darkening up the eye again. And I'm going to darken up the ear. Now I'm just darkening up the snow in between the legs. I want to give more contrast. So I'm darkening up that snow so that the lighter polar bear's legs, there's more contrast between the legs of the polar bear and the snow. So I'm just darkening up by the feet of the polar bear as well. And I'm adding more shadow to the legs, using lines that are going with the direction the fur is going in to give a faint look of fur texture. And I'm just adding this darker colour to the darkest shadows for the legs. So I'm just picking out a few key areas. I'm not adding it all over the leg at all because you don't want to lose those highlights and those lighter washes. Now I'm using some even darker paint just to build up a couple more of the darkest shadows on the legs of the polar bear. Again, using those lines to create the look of fur. And I'm just going to go over those areas with a tissue so that they're not so dark. So I'm just tapping lightly over it with a clean tissue just to lighten it up a tiny bit. I'm also going to work and build up some more shadows on the back leg as well. Really darken that up and add the main shadows because that's still only got the first layer of the first wash of colour down. So I want to build up some of those darker shadows using a slightly darker wash of colour. You can see with this second wash I definitely am focusing on getting in a few more details rather than just blocking it in. I'm very much using those lines to give the look of fur to the animal. I'm going to go in and darken up a few more shadows underneath by the neck, by the legs of the polar bear. Add a few little strokes to add in some shadow there, but first just add a few shadows on the face. I do like to go in with my tissue and lighten up over areas quite a lot. And it may seem like I'm just removing all of the colour, but really I'm just lightening it up. You can still see that it's a little bit darker, but sometimes I don't want it to be so dark. So you can see I just darkened up a little bit underneath by the neck of the polar bear. Between the legs, more the body of the polar bear. It's not really in the neck, is it? It's between the legs. Adding a bit more shadow in between the legs, that snow in between the legs, and also darkening up at the bottom of the feet a bit more as well. Just lightening that up with the tissue. Now I'm starting to build up the darkest shadows throughout the whole of the polar bear. So I'm working on each of the feet, on the feet of the polar bear, and I'm just getting in all of the shadows around the edge as well by the snow. And I just really want to make the polar bear pop against its surroundings. I'm also working on the legs of the polar bear and on the body, just basically going throughout and finally going in and adding the darkest shadows in order to make this pop. And once again, because this is a detailed layer, one of our final layers, I am using quite a lot of details in this layer when I'm getting in the shadows. So yeah, for the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to be looking at the reference image, identifying the darkest parts of the polar bear and just painting them in. And then I'll come back to talk you through the next step. Now that we've really built up the shadows throughout the polar bear, I'm going to go in and darken up a little bit of the snow a bit more. So just a few areas I'm going to go in and make them darker. So in between the legs is one area that I am really starting to darken up so that the polar bear stands out more. But as you can see, I'm also working some shadows throughout the ripples and bumps in the snow as well. Because when the layers dry, watercolours appear lighter when they're fully dried than they did when they were wet. So you may think that when it's wet it looks dark enough, but bear in mind that once watercolours dry they do appear lighter. So you may have to go in with an additional layer and just darken up a few areas, because it might not dry as dark as you think it will. Just tapping in some shadows. And you can see adding in these shadows throughout the snow does give it more of a bumpy look rather than it just being smooth. Especially where the polar bear is standing on, it looks more textured, the snow does. So I'm really just doing the final details here before we go in and start to add in highlights with the gouache, and we're going to be using a fine liner as well to add a few details around the polar bear as well. But you can see how very quickly we've managed to create something that already looks really good. Now I'm going to create a few splatters with the Payne's Grey. I do love doing splatters. I think it makes the painting look really cool and interesting. You want to make sure there's enough paint on your brush. Mixing in some more Payne's Grey so that the splatters are a bit darker. And just creating some splatters all around the painting. I also like to do this with gouache as well later on. The larger brush you use, the bigger the splatters are going to be. So if you want really small splatters, then use a small paintbrush like this one. But if you want bigger droplets, then you can switch over to a larger paintbrush. Now I'm just adding some shadow around the polar bear just to create more contrast once more by darkening up around the polar bear in the sky. Just dabbing over it with a tissue so it's not so harsh and dramatic. And I'm just working a few shadows throughout the sky, but I really don't want to get rid of that effect that was created by the salt, so I'm not adding too much paint to the background now, to the sky. I'm just going to finish off adding a couple of tweaks with the Payne's Grey, and then I will move on to the next step where we'll be using gouache to add some highlights. Now mixing up some white gouache to use for the highlights. I've let all of the painting dry, so all of that watercolour is now dry. So you want to make sure you've let your layers of your paint completely dry before you go in and add more layers with the white gouache. I'm using the Winsor & Newton Permanent White Gouache, and it's the designer's gouache. And I'm just mainly going to be using this to brighten up some areas, for example the ear that did get covered up by the watercolours for the sky, so I just want to highlight that and brighten that up a bit more. We don't need to use the gouache too much because we have done a really good job here of preserving the white of the paper. But I will be using the white gouache for things like splatters, maybe to add a bit of fur detail, and also for a few areas of the snow. So I'm just working and adding a few highlights throughout the snow now. Using quite a lot of water in there because I do want this to be very subtle. And I just again want to create a bumpy look. And I'm focusing on the brightest sections of the snow. And you can use this to lighten up any areas that you feel have got a bit dark. So for example, this area up here has a very light wash of the blue, but I want to brighten it up, so I'm going over it with some white gouache, just to brighten it up once more. I'm also going to be adding a few splatters with the gouache. Don't worry if you make some splatters that you don't like, then you can always use a tissue just to remove them whilst the paint is still wet. I'm mixing in a bit of water and I'm just tapping on the back of my paintbrush to give these really pretty twinkly splatters, and this helps to give the look of snow as well. Mixing in some more water so that it comes off easier off my brush, and I'm just splattering all around the painting. I'm going back to working on some highlights for the snow. Just mixing up some more opaque gouache, and I'm going to use this now to create some little fur details. So you can see I'm just creating a few little brush strokes in the direction that the fur would be going in, just to give more of a furry look to the polar bear. Now I'm not going to do too many because I don't want to get rid of the watercolour effects underneath, but I just want to add a few little details just to give the impression of fur. Mainly to the outsides of the legs, so you can see I'm doing fur strokes that are going over into the snow in between the legs, and also by the neck of the polar bear. Just adding some fur to the back legs. And really you don't want to go overboard with the gouache, because sometimes it can be very easy to overdo it. So I'm just going to finish off creating those fur markings. I'm also just adding a few more highlights to the snow. And I'm going to go in and add a few more splatters as well. I feel like we need a couple more splatters. So I'm loading my brush up with paint so that I can add a few more of these splatters all around the painting. Now to finish this off, I just want to go in with a fine liner and just use this to darken up a few areas, adding in a few details and mainly to outline the polar bear a little bit. Now I don't want everything to look outlined too much, so I'm just going to be focusing this on a couple of areas. So I'm going around the face and around the ear, and I'm just using a small fine liner. This is a Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pen in the size small. You can see I'm just going around a couple of areas just around the body. If you want, you can wait for the gouache to completely dry before you do this. And just adding this line just makes it stand out and pop so much more from the background. But you can see that I'm just really outlining the outsides, and I'm not doing it too thick either. I don't want it to look like it's stuck onto the sky in the snow. But I'm not going in between all of the legs and darkening up all of them too much either. I don't want it to look like the polar bear's a sticker. I still want it to have a nice illustrative look to it. So instead of just drawing straight outlines, you can see that I'm incorporating the look of fur into it. So I'm doing some like fur strokes with the fine liner to give it more of a natural look. I'm also outlining the edge of the snow a little bit as well. Just finishing off by outlining the bottom of the feet. And just along the main sort of anatomy of the animal, for example, the bottom of the body, the sides of the legs, but just a little bit. But anyway guys, that is pretty much it for this first painting. I really hope you enjoyed following along to this one. So I'm just going to finish off by removing the tape. In the next tutorial we are going to be working on a robin on a branch with a lot of snow as well. And we've also got some winter trees and a bauble painting as well in this series. So if you did this, then make sure to post it in the community page. I'd love to see what you did, and I will see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye everybody.